Right. Our discussion today is about the genre of the picaresque, and I'm like going to talk about the history of the genre, the reasons, the particular reasons for the rise of the genre, and also talk about its impact on the rise of the English novel, and finally take a look at the trajectory of the picaresque post the 18th century. These are some of the uh, basic phenomenon that I'm going to discuss with you. Right now, the picaresque comes actually from Spain to the rest of Europe, but even before it begins in Spain, we find certain, uh, shadows of the picaresque, as it were, or traces of the picaresque, rather, in a few classical forms. For example, the Milesian tale, the Golden Ass, for example, or Satyricon, for example, by Petronius, of course, would have elements of loose tales strung together with comedy and a certain amount of what we will call uh, antisocial behavior or behavior beyond social normative practices. Now, these would be known collectively as Milesian tales. And very often the tale would center around figures who would be on the fringes of society. And uh, very importantly, they would also, in many ways, uh, talk about the, they would in many ways talk about the kind of satiric portraits of corruption in society. So, a genre of satire told usually by the members of the lower classes in society and combining the element of comedy, humor, and satire, depending on the figure of the trickster. These were aspects that the picaresque, I'm sorry, that the Milesian tale was circulating in classical society. You have to understand, of course, that one part of literature, as Bakhtin would talk about, and these are small prose narratives, would always be radical in challenging the established social stereotypes and would be consumed by the public at large for pleasure. So I am assuming that the Milesian tale would be part of this tradition of a literature that would satisfy the urges and uh, the radical need to sort of question authority. Now, around the 15th or the 16th century in Spain, we see the state engaging in numerous activities of war. Also important is the close interaction between Spain and the Arabs. And therefore, there's another tradition of literature which is filtering into European literature as such. And this is the makamat uh, kind of a narrative, which again, of course, very few are extant nowadays, uh, talk about this trickster figure who can then stand outside society, travel widely, and satirize the different kinds of figures of society. Now, very often the makamat figures would uh, satirize, because of their status outside religion, the religious conventions of Spanish Catholic churches. So, in that sense, there was a degree of religious satire also involved here. What I'm trying to suggest is that there is a kind of a prose literature available to the writers at large, based on which they could have created the model of the picaresque. Now, for the earliest picaresque, we have to go back to 1554. This is the definitive uh, text that kind of establishes the picaresque as a form. Although let me underline the fact that the word picaresque is never used in this text. But it shows all the characteristics of the picaresque. Is Lazarillo de Tormes, written by an anonymous author. Now, it is here that I'd like to come back to this origin of the word, the etymology of the word picaro, or the picaroon from which this entire genre is taken. It means, in around the 17th century, it would mean a kind of a rogue, right? A rogue, or somebody who does not always follow the law. But it's not very clear exactly what or how this word was circulating in contemporary Spain. The picaro, for example, could be a beggar. And remember that, beggars, criminals were drafted into the Spanish army at this point of time because of its, expanding, uh, because of its expanding activities, because of its, as it were, colonial thrust, and in general, the expansion of the Spanish Empire in Europe. So it could mean beggars as well as criminals drafted into the army. The second thing that we'll also need to know is that picaro could also be used in the sense of a wanderer, and travel and mobility, are central to the picaresque theme. So we have a gamut of three possible meanings through which the modern picaro as rogue comes through to us. One is beggar, the other is criminal or rogue, and the third is the wanderer. Now, also notice here that the association between the picaresque and capitalism in early Spain, early modern Spain, is quite pronounced. It is in the 16th century that we see the incursion of the capitalist enterprise, a degree of massive mobilization and mobility, the expansion of the Spanish army, and therefore a significant presence of people on the road, and the incursion of what we will call a culture of delinquency. What happened is, once these criminals, beggars entered the army, they create their own sort of culture of violence, swindling, criminality also within the army. So there is this suggestion of a spirit of delinquency that grips society during the, let us call it, the mid 17th century in Spain, and one which is provoked by an encroaching capitalist endeavor of individual gain, class mobility, mobility in terms of space and time. Therefore, these are some of the, let us say, elements through which the picaresque as a form emerges in Spain in the 17th century. And therefore, these are some of the impulses that the picaro picks up. So Lazarillo, if we study carefully, Lazarillo sort of breeds almost immediately in 1559 another narrative, and this is one we can pinpoint to a particular author. This is Matteo Aleman, The name of the text is Guzman the Alfarashi. Guzman the Alfarashi. Now, between Lazarillo as a figure and Guzman, there are a few crucial differences that we also need to take a very careful look at. You see, Lazarillo is a slave and he is trying to seek gainful employment through numerous masters. And as a slave, he's also on the fringes of society, an outsider to society. And he sort of takes up the different professions: a priest, for example, a painter, for example, a gentleman, for example, and finds that in each profession there is corruption and beggary, right? And therefore, he is forced, as it were, into acts of trickery so that he can sustain both himself and his own master. Therefore, what happens is a continuous movement. The narrative is divided into several episodic structures. Thirdly, every episode leads us to different class figures or professional figures. Fourthly, the narrative is based on acts of trickery or beggary that Lazarillo performs not merely for himself but also for the sake of his associates. And finally, it takes on this garb of this young Lazarillo, who is a boy when the narrative turns, but transforms into the more mature, cynical Lazarillo by the time the narrative has come to an end. So it's in that sense that you see that the Picaresque is also a twin Bildungsroman, in the sense that the narrator grows, the narrator of the hero grows more, cynical in that sense of the term, and as well as the reader also grows more cynical as the narrative grows. So it's a Bildungsroman, a narrative of growth in that sense, which provides just an acute satirical glimpse into a society where everything seems to be. See, where it seems to suggest that not only is the Picaro a rogue, but everybody in society is roguish. And therefore, what I was trying to suggest is that the point has been made that what the Picaro or what the Picaresque narrative wants to point out is not merely a thrust towards the personality of the Picaro, who in any case is outside society, as it were, or on the margins of society, but the intention of the Picaresque is to provide a satiric portrait of a society under delinquency. And this is where we can relate, this entire genre to its context of the delinquent Spain of the 1550s, which is rampant with corruption, throbbing with capitalistic enterprise, and therefore, marked by a degree of swindling and so on and so forth. Right. But the point is to be noted that Lazarillo's efforts are not always criminal. He begs, he sort of cons people, but it is not directly criminal or extremely violent. But when we come to this 1559 text by Aleman, the text Guzman the Alfarashi, we find that the Picaro's personality has now changed. There is a suggestion of growth, movement, and so on and so forth. But the movement is through different layers of criminality. So by this time, the comic energy within the 5 years, the comic energy of the Picaresque sort of moves into a kind of a society which is rampant with corruption and criminality and violence. Right? We need to also remember that the world of the Picaresque is a world of casual violence which society inflicts upon people, which is seen in terms of comicality. So it's an interesting way in which the Picaresque as a form sort of uh, evolves within the 5 years and provides us with two directions. One, the comic Picaresque, and the other, the violent, more serious, as it were, Picaresque mode. Now, based on this, of course, based on these two narratives, we have a certain definition of the Picaresque. Uh, uh, let me quote from Lazarillo. Uh, the Spanish is todos roban, todos mienten, todos champion, ninguno campo con lo que debe. Everyone steals, everyone lies, everyone swindles, no one does what they should, and even worse, they are proud of it. You see, that is the entire atmosphere of the Spanish Picaresque. And therefore, it's interesting in the way that the Picaresque is emerging at this particular point of time, as you can see, as antagonistic to the idealist narratives of the chivalric, pastoral, and sentimental romances. So, on the one hand, we have these aristocratic, class structured, idealistic romances. On the other hand, you have these darker, humorous, far more realistic. One of the things that you need to also realize is that the prose of the Picaro is far more realistic and earthy than the high aristocratic prose of the romances. So there is a clear structure to the Picaresque. The adult narrator is describing his upbringing. So how the Picaresque or how the Picaro became the Picaro, and social climbing with biting satire. So that is the predominant tone of the satire of the Picaresque: biting satire, critical point of view, and therefore a degree of self-deprecation and social critique. So once again, let me remind you of what Lazarillo is saying. Everyone steals, everyone lies, everyone swindles. So the individual tale of the Picaro becomes therefore a holistic satire on a universe where individualism rules, where individual interest rules, and where the community moral standards are crumbling. So take a text like, say, those of you who did your Volpone, remember in 1605, Johnson is writing this play within 5 weeks. And in Johnson, similarly, we face a world where every single moral system, be it the relationship between the father and the son, the husband and the wife, the lawyer and his profession, are crumbling under this pressure of the new capitalist economy that is seeking to prioritize, as it were, money and self-interest at the center of the universe. So the Picaresque, I would say, is squarely caught in this emergent capitalist network and reacts more specifically in a particular Spanish condition to a culture of delinquency. If you take a very careful look at it, you see the characteristics of the Picaresque, as it were identified very clearly by Chandler, by Frank Chandler in his PhD on the same topic. He later on expanded this into a book. And I'm quoting from Chandler. Chandler says, the picaresque novel of the Spaniards presents a rogue relating his adventures. So very often it's a first-person narrative, which is going to be important when we discuss the rise of the novel. He's born of poor and dishonest parents, so lineage in either the peasantry or in criminality, were not often troubled with gracing their union by a ceremony, so are often, bastards in that sense of the term. Therefore, you can relate with Tom Jones later on. He enters with the world with an innate love of the goods of others, or he's innocent and learns by hard raps that he must take care of himself or go to the wall. So self-interest, hard-nosed self-interest. In order to live, he must serve somebody, and the gains of service he finds himself obliged to augment with the gains of roguery. So he flits from one master to another, right? So there is this, continuous mobility from person to person, one profession to profession, one class to another, right? Finally, having run through a variety of strange vicissitudes, measuring by his rule of roguery the vanity of human estates, he brings his story to a close. Now, traditionally, the picaresque therefore ends with a kind of, let us say, philosophy, as it were, that all mankind is roguish. Now, these are some of the characteristics of the picaresque. Elsewhere, of course, the picaresque has been, identified in terms of 7 defining characteristics. The first is that it is written in first person. So that's one definitive characteristic. A strategy with the novel is sort of borrowing. 2, the main character is of low character of social class, right? So there's this very distinct class characteristic of the picaresque. The third is that the plot is episodic, linked together by the presence of the Picaro and his movement from one, story to the other, as it were. Fourthly, that, and this is very important, that the Picaro may actually sort of deepen into criminality, but he does not reform himself. So the picaresque does not give us any story of redemption. It's not a moral story. There is no moral in the picaresque, as it were. The picaresque is a story of, the later picaresque is a story of continuous criminality. And this is very important, you see, because this is what will differentiate the picaresque, the true picaresque, from the part picaresque, which will come later on. The next characteristic is that the story is told in a prose that is marked by realism, satire, and humor, right? So the language is earthier. Very often profanities are used. So instead of a language of romance, which is, as it were, much more sublime, much more refined, the picaresque brings a more realistic prose into the text. And finally, the Picaro is flirts, or rather, the Picaro is on that liminal boundary between radical behavior and criminal behavior. He does not very often step into criminality, but he can sort of, because primarily he's living on by swindling others. So conning others is one of the characteristics of the picaresque. Now, interestingly, the next text, which I would very briefly discuss, is a text which most of you know. And this is Don Quixote. And the date of Don Quixote, remember, is 1605. So almost on the heels of Guzman de Alfaraj, we have Cervantes writing in Don Quixote about what the form of his text is. Remember once again that Don Quixote is that very difficult text to pin down in terms of genre with its multiple dialogic potential. And in one particular episode, although ironically probably, Quixote actually refers to Lazarillo as a kind of a narrative to which this particular kind belongs to. But as has been pointed out, the premises of the Picaresque and of Don Quixote are largely different. What are the analogies? The analogies are in the episodic plotting linked by the presence of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. The link is through the continuous mobility that Don Quixote undergoes through different layers of society. But the difference is that, first and foremost, Don Quixote does not delude anybody apart from himself, and that Don Quixote is himself a fool rather than the Picaro who fools others. So, in that sense, Don Quixote is more of an anti romance than a picaresque. It takes the mobility and the episodic structure of the picaresque, but it sort of cuts out the criminality and the kind of self uh, self obsession of the picaresque, as it were, the self interest, and the impulse is towards the satire against the genre rather than a satire against society in general. Therefore, when Cervantes talks uh, about the picaresque, he's probably referring to this suggestion that the Picaro is a wanderer, and that is where he's probably leading Don Quixote towards. So, once again, sort of alerting you to the possible ramifications or the range of etymologies through which the picaresque was passing in the early, let's say, uh, stage. Now, this was the Spanish picaresque. The Picaro then travels through the translations of Guzman and Lazarillo to the rest of Europe, and it reaches France, where it is extensively sort of translated. It reaches Italy, and of course, it reaches, you know, uh, Germany, because that's the next major destination where I'll stop. Germany, 1669. So it's almost 100 years later that we find an interesting text which combines the German adventure novel with the picaresque, and it is called Simplicius Simplicismus. Simplicius Simplicismus. Now, the difference here is that Simplicius comes from a peasant family. He himself is swindled and therefore decides to become a criminal. And the narrative follows the different acts of, sort of swindling people again, fooling people, and parting them of their wealth. Now, it's interesting in the way that Simplicius becomes a crucial text because, uh, in many senses, you see, it talks about a man being led into criminality rather than being born into it. Right. And therefore, you sense this idea that, you know, the with the kind of social churning that is happening in Europe and people falling into poverty, traveling to the cities. The picaresque, by the way, is more or less an urban genre again. Although there is a lot of traveling, there is a significant amount of the presence of the Picaro in the city. Right. So there is this idea that a person is led into poverty and into criminality. And that is where I would like to locate Simplicismus. Now, obviously, of course, very interestingly, you also find England as a source of the picaresque again. Now, the picaresque, of course, enters England through a lot of uh, you see, these coney catching pamphlets, as it were. There is a whole range of this kind of criminal rogue literature present in England in the Elizabethan times. You have the coney catching pamphlets. You have, with the rise of organized crime in the cities, you have pickpockets, highwaymen, and a galaxy of criminal literatures, criminal biographies coming up with Grub Street. But what happens is these are very smallish, you can say largely disorganized pieces of narrative. What is important here is that the picaresque tradition now is put into a narrative that is beginning to emerge in 18th century England based on factuality located among the lower classes, which is the true history. So, what I'm trying to suggest is that the picaresque is entering into the discourse of the news/novels that we talked about in an earlier class. It is largely talking about actual criminals, the process of becoming a criminal, their acts of criminality, and then again taking on a fictional garb. Now, let me begin by referring to the first major picaresque narrative, and that is Moll Flanders. By the way, one of the things that I should also talk about, that the Spanish picaresque does not talk about salvation. It does not talk about religion much. Neither does the German Simplicismus. Right. But when we come to Defoe, we see that Defoe is falling back upon two major traditions. One is the criminal biography. And remember that Defoe is actually visiting the notorious pickpocket and thief called Moll King in prison, taking down his life history. By the way, Lazarillo de Thomas and Guzman were probably both written after extensive interviews with convicts, criminals, soldiers, and so on and so forth. So, Almiron was looking at the actual lives of these people, and so was Defoe. So, the criminal narrative at this point of time would be a very salacious, story about how the criminal was from his young age initiated into criminality, his daring, exploits, and a final announcement that he would, of course, meet his maker in Tyburn Tree, where he would be hung. And these criminals were, these public hangings were very well attended, where the criminal would get an almost quasi-heroic status. Now, along with this, Defoe, in the text that I'm looking at is a 1722 text of Moll Flanders. Along with this, Defoe is bringing in another structured narrative, and that is the Puritan Autobiography. What did the Puritan Autobiography do? It talked about personal quotidian experience, the sinful life, an act of repentance, and therefore an act of salvation. Right. So we have two distinctly different narratives. One is the criminal narrative, read for pleasure, read by the lower classes for the exploitation, where the criminal is seen as a hero. And the other is where the sinful man is seen as somebody who can move through experience to repentance and to salvation. What Defoe does in Moll Flanders is he takes the true Moll King and merges him with the Puritan Autobiography to emerge through Moll Flanders. Now, it is at this point of time that we also need to ask ourselves one more question. And why was the Picaro, or why was this narrative so popular? There are several reasons for this. One is that with rampant capitalism, self interest, you see, the narrative of the Picaresque would vibe, would chime in with people who were moving to the cities. After all, city life was cutthroat and brutal. You would either survive or you would be defeated. So the Picaro was a kind of an aspirational hero for a lot of people who could survive in this cutthroat world based on his intelligence and wit of duping other people. Two, there was, of course, this delight in, or the pleasure in, this act of the Picaro duping other people. That is why we go to see, films like Now You See Me, or, people who, Bunty or Bubbly is a classic Picaresque tale, as it were, where, the protagonist survived by duping other people. So the rise of what we will call the anti-hero, where morality, as it were, becomes a fuzzy logic. The third thing, of course, what we look at is that the common people were looking at the politicians of the period and seeing rampant corruption and criminal behavior. So it is in this sense that when John Gay writes The Beggar's Opera, he writes a very interesting line. He says, it is not clear who is imitating whom. The gentlemen of the road are imitating the gentlemen, or vice versa. Gentlemen of the road are outlaws, and gentlemen are the politicians. So Gay is asking this question: who is imitating whom? Who are the greater criminals, politicians or the criminals? So this, kind of mutual, this awareness of a society which has lapsed into chaotic criminality and self-interest was making the Picaro, therefore, a protagonist of popularity, a person whom people would actually sort of read about, imitate, and very often behave like it. And therefore, for the novel, which was a very organized narrative, the Picaro presented a problem. He had to be accommodated because he had the energy of the popular hero, which the narrative required. At the same time, he had to be somehow modified and reformed so that the novel could have its moral ending. Right? So, because the novel was also trying to sort of gain a degree of legitimacy. So, in novel after novel, what you have is actually the use of the Picaresque, but the ending is not of the Picaresque. The ending is where the Picaro, as it were, where the thief or the criminal is integrated within society. Moll Flanders is married, and she finally retires to America, where she becomes a plantation owner and a very respectable member of society, which the Picaro, by the way, would never have been. He or she would always lie beyond the periphery of society. And therefore, what we do have in Moll Flanders are actually episodes where she's stealing some jewelry from a child. She's giving us an account of how she's, pilfering cloth, linen, and so on and so forth in the tradition of the Picaresque. At the same time, these are followed by, Christian passages of penitence, repentance, and great passion, which are antithetical to the Picaresque again. So the novel, or the acceptance of the Picaresque within the text, is one which is only partial and compromised. And this is a feature of almost all recurring novels. Now take a look at Joseph Andrews, of course. Joseph Andrews is, of course, not a criminal. The only picaresque element that we find in Joseph Andrews is that Joseph Andrews moves around in society. The mobility of the picaresque is something that the novel borrows. The one novel which comes approximate to the picaresque and which we will discuss in some detail is Tom Jones, of course. Now, Tom is a bastard like the picaresque base born, and it is said of Tom Jones that he's born to be hanged. Therefore, he has his criminal, radical impulses, as it were, not criminal in the sense that he sort of moves beyond the boundary of social behavior. For example, he hunts in other people's square Western's territory, which could be a criminal offense, and he saves Black George when he has sort of killed a beast. He's promiscuous. He beds every woman that he can lay his hands on, and is turned out of Paradise Hall for being, boisterous when Squire Allworthy is sick and beating up Square and Thwackum. So Tom seems to be a kind of the Picaro who exists on the fringes of society, both in terms of his actions as well as his class and upbringing. But there's one very crucial difference in that Tom Jones is never immoral. Let me not use the word immoral. All his acts are from acts of charity. So when he saves Black George, he's trying to save him from poverty. When he's beating, say, Thwackum, he's drunken and celebrating Squire Allworthy's lack of, sort of revival from illness. Even finally, when he's sent to the gallows, we find that he's actually not murdered Fitzpatrick in a duel. Fitzpatrick is very much alive. And finally, all his acts are acts of charity, as opposed to the figure of Blifil, who is hypocritical. In that sense, the actual Picaro, or the so-called Picaro, rather not the actual Picaro, the so-called Picaro, Tom Jones, turns out to be the actual hero of the novel and the heir to Paradise Hall. So it's a reversal, really. The supposed Picaro now becomes the heir apparent. What is his problem? His problem is his sexual desire, his libido, which he cannot control. And therefore, Allworthy, in the final sort of advice to Tom, talks about his judgment rather than his morality, right? And he talks about temperance, tempering his passion, rather than any innate criminality within him. So the novels that you are looking at as picaresques have only picaresque elements. The suggestion that he's base born, the suggestion that he's born to be hanged, his mobility across society, satirical representations of various women and members of society, especially in London, in Lord Fellamar or Lady Bellaston. But in reality, it turns out that Tom Jones is not a picaresque at all. But finally, the apparently Picaro Tom is integrated within society and actually becomes the cornerstone of that society. So Tom Jones cannot be categorized as a picaresque at all. It just has elements of the picaresque. There's only one real true picaresque that Fielding wrote, and that was Jonathan Wild. Jonathan Wild's career, of course, many of you will know that he was a thief taker. He was a con man par excellence, in the sense that he would receive goods from the thieves and sell it back to the original people. So if I lost a ring, which would be valuable to me, I would actually go to Jonathan Wild. Jonathan Wild would get it from another person, from the thief, and sell it back to me. Say, if it was $50, he would sell it to me at $20 and buy it from the thief at $5. So he was on the one hand acting for the law, he was on the other hand acting against the law, and he was finally hanged. Now, when Fielding writes the history of Jonathan Wild, he is actually sort of writing a true picaresque, the only true picaresque to have been written in the 18th century. The other texts, of course, which many of you will remember, are Roderick Random by Tobias Smollett. Once again, being kidnapped by the press gang, taken as a sailor, moving around society, savagely satiric about society, all aspects of the picaresque. But Roderick Random, like Tom Jones, is not a criminal. And he is finally integrated within society. Although in his mobility, in his satire in society, and in his criticism of the culture of individualism and profit in society, Roderick Random is somewhere a picaresque. People have suggested that Lawrence Stern's sentimental journey is a picaresque. That's absolutely nonsense. It isn't. And Stern is marked by tremendous pity and sentiment for his fellow beings, and therefore that picaresque mode does not exist in Fielding. There are suggestions that Voltaire's Candide used the picaresque mode, but once again, it's the mobility and the satire rather than any real isolation of the picaresque, staying outside the fringes of society, not integrating, and any real lapse into criminality. Now, the picaresque, of course, after when capitalism has established itself as a practice and is accepted, the picaresque loses its steam, because it gained its steam precisely in that twilight moment when a kind of a medieval society was moving towards a capitalist society, and there was a profound concern and unrest about what would mean for the morality of society. Now, once capitalism is embellished and established in society, the picaresque, as it were, dies out into either the adventure novel or the memoir novel or the proper Bildungsroman. And we have, elements of the picaresque only marginally. People have suggested that Dickens's Pickwick Papers is a picaresque. Once again, I do not agree, because the comic energy of Pickwick is very different from the comic energy of the picaresque. There is no question of swindling again. Pickwick becomes a butt of satire himself. The Picaro, on the other hand, is the prism through which the satire operates. We have Thackeray, for example, using it in a number of his novels, but once again, the mobility rather, and the satiric energy rather than any real criminality. Therefore, Thackeray's novels are often called Victorian picaresques. And the modern novel has used it sporadically. There are, novels like Salinger, for example, using it in his own novels. Kerouac, for example, on the road, using it, using the mobility and the energy of the picaresque. I'd like to just sort of bring this discussion or the history of the picaresque to a conclusion by referring to one text which many of you have read. If you've not read it, do read it, or do see the film based on it, film or a TV series. I think it's a TV series. Is Arvind Adiga's The White Tiger, and you'll find that Adiga uses, this young boy from the outskirts of Bihar, who sort of comes to the city and witnesses the kind of corruption that is taking place within a so-called nouveau rich society. And he's asked to take on the blame of actually killing an individual in a car which his mistress is actually driving. And it is at this point of time that Adiga's text goes on to the protagonist actually murdering his master, and then establishing himself with the same paradigms of self-interest in a different city and becoming an entrepreneur. So ultimately, there are the very strong picaresque elements, but the difference here is that the Picaro is not on the fringes any longer. The Picaro has internalized the energies of the criminality of society and has become an established, successful businessman whose history is based on a criminality. So it's in this idea that all, businessmen and all established people in society are actually picaros. It is in that sense then that Adiga's The White Tiger becomes a kind of an Indian picaresque, which uses the picaro and the picaresque mood to talk about, the ways in which capitalism changes or challenges the moralities of conventional Indian society. That then was a history of the picaresque, its rise, the reasons for its rise. What was the importance of the picaresque? This is the last part of my discussion. The picaresque was one of the narratives which was transforming the novel by redefining the notion of the hero. If the romance had prioritized or made clear distinctions between the hero and the anti hero in terms of morality, the picaresque, the criminal narrative, was bringing into focus a new kind of a hero who would not be an aristocrat, which the novel borrows, who would not fit into conventional morality, be it Tom Jones or Joseph Andrews or, say, Moll Flanders, who would move across the length and breadth of society, mobility, would talk about experiences where, moralities would be compromised, be it, Tom Jones bedding every woman that he meets or Moll Flanders stealing a necklace. But and therefore, in Tom Jones, for example, Fielding will give us an interesting idea. He will suggest that please do not condemn anything as immoral just like that. So the picaresque narrative actually, through its realist narration and its realistic representation of a society where self-interest was paramount, was pushing a new kind of an anti-hero into the foreground, where the clear-cut boundaries between good and evil could be questioned, and through that question, the self-fashioning of the individual caught within a capitalist system could be critically examined. That, I think, is the major contribution of the picaresque to the 18th century novel at large. Right. So it is with that, therefore, that I would like to bring my part of the discussion to an end. Should you have any specific questions? Well, of course, you can see that today not really today. I do sit prepared, but today I was extra prepared because I was dealing with text that many of you will not have read, and therefore, I had to read up sections from Guzman and Lazarillo and bring together a kind of the idea of the picaresque as one of the forerunners or one of the genres from which the novel actually borrowed significantly. Right. So my humble submission would be to go through this lecture once again. I'll put it up on YouTube. Okay, Manisha has a very interesting take on the guide. Interesting, yes, again. But remember that one of the things that you have to remember is that the guide actually commits only one act of duplicity, right? And therefore, his profession is not, he's a guide who can sort of take around tourists, but his essential nature is not to be duplicitous. And in performing that one act of duplicity, which incidentally he never really clarifies, and as it were being forced into it, what Arkenarayan is probably taking a look at is the way in which the the religious man in human society is framed, and therefore the association between, the religion as practiced and religion as a way of fooling people is examined, although we will never be able to really say, what happens at the end. You see, there's this kind of fuzzy ending at the end of the guide. The film, of course, brings down rain, but the actual novel does not really tell us what is going to happen, right? So it's in the sense that, the guide once again uses part of the Picaresque tradition only. It is not in any sense a true Picaresque. Uh, on the other hand, you see, Adiga's novel is far more generous with its Picaresque elements than, say, somebody like Alkinarayan. Okay, so I think, yeah, Tom Sawyer is one. Tom Sawyer is one, but again, Tom Sawyer is a coming of age novel, really, and uh, the degree of innocence that Tom has, although, ultimately he will be civilized with an S, uh, is once again part Picaresque. So do not rush into classifying texts as purely Picaresque. You have to clarify by suggesting that because of these reasons, you know, they are not true Picaresques, but only part Picaresque. Most of the novels that you know as Picaresques are actually part Picaresques only. Right. Okay. So if there are no other questions, I will call it quits today, and I hope you have a fair idea of how the Picaresque. No, Robinson Crusoe is not a Picaresque in any senses of the term. Robinson Crusoe is never seen as a criminal, right? So you cannot classify Robinson Crusoe as a Picaresque at all, right? Okay, then. So if there are no other, you think about the other texts as well. You could think about a large number of Bangla texts as well, where the Picaresque could come in. So, I would be interested later on in you thinking about them. I think it's an important tradition through which the novel, or which percolates down to the novel, to frame its notion of heroism, the hero, and the what has been called the unheroic hero of the novel, and the question of a fuzzy or a grayish moral fabric within the novel, as compared with the kind of clear cut distinctions within the romance, right? So in the gamut of texts that were circulating in 18th century Britain, the Picaresque was one, and the Picaresque had an osmotic reaction, as it were, with the novel. It is with those words that I'll like to stop the recording for the time being. And if there are any questions, then we can